welcome to What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. This week, I'm talking to Dr Carl Elliott, whose life changed forever when he tried to alert his university about the suicide of a patient on a drugs trial. The patient's mother felt strongly that he should never have been enrolled in the trial in the first place. Carl's battle came at a huge personal and emotional cost, and at the end of years of campaigning and lobbying, he felt little had really changed. His disillusioning experience as a whistleblower has driven him to meet others who faced similar situations. And it seems few escape with their careers and personal lives intact. In a new book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No, published by Norton and Company, Carl reveals both his own personal painful story and that of other medical whistleblowers too. But before we get to the details of Carl's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttell or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyou.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at LizCTucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to Carl's interview. Dr. Carl Elliott is a bioethicist at the University of Minnesota, trained in both medicine and philosophy. He has published widely in academic literature and also in publications including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. Here's his interview. So, Carl, thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Carl, I suppose no one sets out to be a whistleblower. It's just that events sort of overtake them.
That's true. Nobody really chooses to do it. They are sort of thrust into it. Very often don't even describe it as having chosen to do it. It's more as if they have no choice, that they're pulled into it and sort of overtaken by events.
Now, the circumstances in which you became a whistleblower are, in some ways, I think, a little unusual, because it actually started when you discovered about events that had happened sometime in the past concerning a trial in 2003.
Yes, I teach at the University of Minnesota, and at that point I was teaching in the medical school in the Center for Bioethics. A reporter named Paul Tosto sent me a series of articles, actually, that he and a colleague, Jeremy Olson, had written. He just wanted to know what I made of it. The story was about a young, mentally ill man named Dan Markingson in a clinical trial. He was severely mentally ill. I mean, he was floridly psychotic, talking to angels and demons and deluded and violent, which is how he wound up in the emergency room at our teaching hospital, and had been judged dangerous to himself and others and mentally ill and put on a locked unit and eventually placed under a civil commitment order that required him to obey the treatment recommendations of his psychiatrist. At that point, he was asked to sign a consent form while under the commitment order, while on the locked unit, to take part in a clinical trial, a comparative clinical trial of 3 antipsychotic drugs, Seroquel, Zyprexa, and Risperdal. His mother didn't want him in the trial. She begged for him not to be in the trial. They simply said, look, he signed the consent form. He's an adult. It's his choice. And so they enrolled him anyway.
And this is really important because he was under the civil commitment order. He was legally required to obey the recommendations of his psychiatrist. So if the psychiatrist recommends he joins this trial, the argument was that he couldn't say no.
He couldn't say no, not just legally, but sociologically. I mean, look, he's on a locked unit. He doesn't believe he's mentally ill. He just wants to get out. And the guy who's asking him to sign up for the trial has the power to let him off the locked unit.
He's in full psychosis, so thinks he's communicating with angels, aliens, and that he's been called, I think, to take part in some mass murder event.
Exactly. Yes, he's been threatening to kill people, including his mother. She spent the next 4 months, I think, trying to get him out of the trial, sending emails to the study coordinator, calling the study coordinator, writing letters to the chair of the Department of Psychiatry, saying she's really worried about him. He seems to be getting worse. He's not showering. He seems to be getting more and more agitated all the time. Eventually, she leaves a voice message saying, does he have to kill somebody before anybody does anything? She gets no reply to that. And then 3 weeks later, he takes a box cutter and slits his own throat. Clearly, the drug wasn't working. One possibility is that his agitation was coming from side effects of the drug, akathisia, but we don't know that. All we know is that he was getting worse. The drug was not helping him. His mother could see it, and her pleas for help were ignored.
And her pleas for help were ignored by the doctors.
The doctors, the study coordinators, anybody.
So she then files a lawsuit.
Yes. The lawsuit is dismissed on grounds that the University of Minnesota is statutorily immune from liability for the case. So regardless of the merits of the case, it can't go ahead.
Why does it have the statutory immunity?
I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you.
So not only is the lawsuit unsuccessful, but the university actually sues for costs, some of the legal costs that the university has incurred.
Right. Once they get the immunity ruling, the university turns around and files what they call a notice to assess costs, demanding $56,000 from Mary Weiss, Dan Markinson's mother. I mean, she can't pay it. She doesn't have the means to pay the University of Minnesota $56,000. And so, on the advice of her lawyers, she comes to an agreement, which is that she will agree not to appeal, to file an appeal for that immunity ruling in exchange for them dropping the notice to assess costs for $56,000. The contrast between her response to meeting me and the response of everyone in a position of power at the University of Minnesota was completely different. At the University of Minnesota, when I brought up these things, I was just simply told, look, the newspaper had it in for the university. The case was completely distorted. You can't believe that. And when I met with Mary Weiss, she just said, you don't have to believe me. I'll let you look at all of the files. You know, you can look at Dan's medical records. You can look at everything that emerged in the lawsuit. You can look at his diaries, whatever you want. I'll open it all up to you. If anything, the more I started to dig, the worse things looked with the trial. I eventually wound up writing an article about this. Later, as a result of that and the sort of ensuing controversy, another subject came forward. And he had a very similar story to tell. It was a different drug and a different study, but same unit, same circumstances. He had become suicidal as well, but he had managed to drop out of the trial.
So once you found out this has been happening, who in the university did you try and contact to say, look, we really need to investigate this further?
Anybody that I could think of, to be honest. You know, I talked to the dean of medicine. I talked to someone in the general counsel's office. I talked to friends in the Department of Psychiatry. I gave a grand rounds in which I talked about it. I talked about it to my colleagues in the Bioethics Center. After I wrote the piece and it was picked up by Minnesota Public Radio, it became an ongoing story. It lasted another 5 years, in fact.
But when you said to the Dean of Medicine, look, I'm concerned about what I've read about this, I really think we need to look at it further, what was her response?
Her response was essentially, you don't know what you're talking about. The newspaper got it all wrong. What I've heard is that the mother of Dan Markinson was crazy and that she had a lot to do with her son's suicide. And essentially that didn't I really understand the way that clinical trials work, that sometimes people die in clinical trials and that's just the way things go.
And we should say, although you don't practice as a doctor, you are a qualified doctor.
This is true.
So you're basically hitting your head against a brick wall.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say I because it wasn't all me by any means. There was a group of us, my colleague in the Bioethics Center, Lee Turner, and a whistleblower nurse in the hospital who had been there when Dan Markingson was recruited into the study and objected to it. Among all of us, this sense of increasing desperation to do something about this. We tried everything that we could think of. I mean, we filed complaints to official agencies, the FDA, the Office of Human Research Protection. We wrote to politicians. We wrote to the state attorney general. We filed complaints to every university office that you can imagine. We had vigils. We had petitions. We wrote to alumni asking them to withhold donations to the university.
Some of which presumably wouldn't make you terribly popular with the university. So how did the department that you were working in react?
Initially, there was support, at least private support. But over time, I think people felt as if this was a futile cause. There was no way that it was going to do any good. The chances of success were zero. And all I was doing was making their lives much harder by alienating everyone at the university in charge of funding, tenure lines, promotion, the existence of the Center for Bioethics. They felt that I was being unfair in targeting our university. I mean, more than once I was told, look, this kind of stuff happens all over. If you want to start a crusade, why don't you start a crusade against another university where this has happened, not, our own.
So finally, after extensive campaigning, there are 2 external reviews commissioned, one by the university and the other led by the state watchdog agency.
Yes, the first was in response to a request to the faculty senate, an open letter signed by, I think, about 70 researchers, health law experts, bioethicists, and so on, asking for an investigation into the Markingson case. The university refused to commission an investigation into the Markingson case, but did agree to have an external review by an accreditation body of the research protection system at the university. The second one came about as a result of the efforts of a former governor of Minnesota, Arne Carlson, who had joined up with our cause and had been pressing relentlessly for an investigation. This was commissioned by the state legislature, and it was conducted specifically of the Markingson case, of Dan Markingson's death, by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is a watchdog agency in the state of Minnesota. First was the review of the research protection system, which found a lot of inadequacies and flaws in our research oversight system, and also found a culture of fear in the Department of Psychiatry, where staff, including nurses, were afraid to speak out about dangers to patients for fear of retaliation. The big one, which was the investigation by the legislative auditor, was absolutely blistering and essentially confirmed all, or at least most, of the issues that those of us who'd objected to the trial in the first place had flagged. And it also singled out the administration of the university for the efforts that it took over the years to prevent any kind of external scrutiny of the study. The researchers in the trial getting consulting and speaking fees.
So these payments would be from the drug company that was sponsoring the trial, but that's actually not unusual in medical studies.
Right. But the chair of the IRB panel, which is responsible for overseeing the study and protecting the rights and welfare of subjects, was also being paid by the sponsor of the trial, and as well as by other antipsychotic manufacturers. And ordinarily, you would expect that this would go to a conflict of interest committee, but he was on that committee as well. So there were financial incentives through and through. I should also say that there were financial incentives to keep subjects in the trial as long as possible. The longer they stayed in the trial, the more money the University of Minnesota was paid. Again, a very problematic design of the trial.
Carl, as you mentioned, the first review said there was a culture of fear amongst staff. And actually, One of the whistleblowing colleagues she'd been working with was a nurse on the ward who'd objected to Dan Markinson being enrolled in the trial.
That's right. That's Nikki Jerry. Patient safety was her job in the hospital. That was what she specialized in. She was not a ward nurse. Her official position, she was a very senior nurse. She has a PhD, was specifically the safety of patients. And she was overruled when she objected that Dan Markinson was too vulnerable to enroll in the study.
And did she have other concerns outside of his particular case?
She and others on the ward were concerned about the recruitment of research subjects from this locked ward. If you are on the locked ward, it means that you're mentally ill and dangerous to yourself or others. And a lot of those subjects are very vulnerable by virtue of their mental state and by virtue of being locked up. It's a place where you want to be very careful about recruiting subjects.
So there've been these 2 reviews, but what impact did the reviews have?
Almost nothing. I mean, that was what was so disappointing about it. We felt as if there was some kind of vindication, at least in the Dan Markinson case. But, no one was punished. There was no compensation offered to Mary Weiss, Dan's mother. There was no formal public apology. They did agree, after more pressure and another study sort of being exposed in the New York Times, they did agree to suspend drug company-sponsored psychiatric research for a period of time. And they did agree to put together an internal review of their research procedures.
So something which has taken up a lot of your life, a lot of your emotion, a lot of your attention. There must have been a sort of sense of frustration after all of that really nothing much happens.
Yeah, it was incredibly disappointing. In fact, I think, if anything, that external review just made us all just more hated at the University of Minnesota. It was almost as if being right made things even worse.
It doesn't sound much fun going to work in that environment.
No, I basically stopped going to my office in the bioethics center. The hostility was so palpable. I got incredibly angry, depressed, obsessed with the case. I mean, when I look back on it in retrospect, this is what strikes me about my own psychological state, is that I could not think of anything else. Probably about 6, 7 years, every day, I woke up thinking about it, couldn't get it out of my head. The only time when I was able to stop thinking about it was when things got even worse. And my father got very sick with Legionnaire's disease and was in the hospital in a series of crises.
So you had to have something even worse happen for it to take your mind off.
Yes, exactly.
I've spoken to quite a few whistleblowers now, and I think that sort of obsession, which is perhaps what you need, frankly, to get anything done, given the odds tend to be stacked against people. And quite often I find it's not just an obsession when things are unfolding, but it's an obsession that can stay with them years, even sometimes decades after the events have finished.
Yes. One of the reasons I wrote the book was as an excuse to talk to other people who had been in similar situations, as a way of trying to figure out whether my own situation was unusual or whether it was part of a pattern. One of the things that I guess I found really surprising, although I shouldn't have in retrospect, was how deep the scars were, from this experience. I mean, some of the people that I talked to, their whistleblowing experience had taken place in the 1970s, in the 1980s. I mean, these are people in their 80s now. They still can't stop thinking about it.
Well, I think particularly when it has dramatic effects on their career and it means their career never recovers, it's perhaps not surprising because it changed the entire course of their life.
Exactly. And that I understood. That I could have predicted. The typical whistleblower story is, one of punishment, retaliation, public humiliation, losing your job, losing your career, very often becoming sick or mentally ill.
And having a tremendously negative effect on your personal life as well.
Yeah, exactly. And you can understand that for someone who's lost everything. What was surprising to me was how deep the wounds were on people who had been successful, or at least from the outside, it looked as if they were successful.
So would you term yourself as a successful whistleblower? I'm interested.
No, I would not. In no way. I mean, if you measure success in terms of concrete change, then I would say that was a failure.
Now, your book is full of breaches of ethics. You yourself, you've obviously taught medical ethics. Do you think these breaches are a fault of humanity or medical school training?
I think probably a combination of both. There are certain things that are common to all organizations and group behavior in modern organizations, particularly bureaucracies. And whistleblowers don't fare well in any organization. It's seen as an act of disloyalty and a threat to the organization and a threat to the well-being of the organization. And so in some ways, the pattern for government whistleblowers and corporate whistleblowers is very similar to the kind of whistleblowers that I'm talking about in academic medicine with medical research. But there are a couple of things that make it, I think, especially difficult in academic medicine. One is that academic medicine tends to be an extraordinarily hierarchical organizational structure, essentially taught from the very start to defer to the people above you. So that makes things hard. The other thing that makes it hard in academic medicine is this sense of moral righteousness around the mission of academic medicine. And they see research as their mission. And it's how you rise in the hierarchy, how you get power, and particularly how you get funding is very essential. It's not just that you do good research, it's that you do good research that is funded by prestigious organizations. That's what propels you up the hierarchy. And speaking out against the very mission of the organization, one that everyone in the organization tends to agree is at the heart of what the organization is all about, I think makes the blowback especially intense.
If I look at other types of whistleblower, in a sense in medicine, sometimes it seems more stark, in many cases, a more obvious moral choice than, say, financial wrongdoing. Now, I'm not supporting financial wrongdoing for a moment.
I agree. I think you're exactly right. One of the things that sort of emerged in the cases that I talked about with the whistleblowers, it's the proximity to those patients who are dying or being abused or mistreated or lied to in some way that propels the whistleblower into the situation where they feel as if they've got no choice at all. The harms of corruption in financial institutions or in government bodies or so on, they're abstract. They're harms. I mean, there are people who are harmed. For example, you can see with the shortcuts that whistleblowers at Boeing have pointed out in airplane manufacturing. There are deaths as a result. But there's something, I think, about the immediacy of medical care and patients being there because they need treatment and seeing them harmed in some way that makes the whistleblowing feel particularly urgent.
Now, in the book, you tell a number of cases of medical whistleblowing, and I thought it'd be interesting to look at a couple that I think are probably a little less well known to listeners. One of which was one whistleblower's struggle against the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in the US, and it concerned a cancer study of bone marrow transplantation called Protocol 126. Carl, can you explain what happened?
This was a protocol that was designed to test a experimental type of bone marrow transplantation.
And this was for leukemia and lymphoma.
Exactly, patients with leukemia and lymphoma. Importantly, these patients with leukemia and lymphoma, if given the standard treatment, for the most part, would have a very good chance of complete remission.
I think in the book you say a standard treatment cure rate as high as 60%.
That's right. The whistleblower in the case is a man named John Pasando, who is MD, PhD, so an oncologist and immunologist with special training in monoclonal antibodies, which is what were being used in this in this study. And he had come from the East Coast to join the faculty of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center with about as stellar an academic record as you could imagine. Harvard, MD, PhD from Albert Einstein, trained at the University of Pennsylvania, assistant professor at Harvard, Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, NIH funded. He really looked like a guy whose career was going to skyrocket. When he got out to Seattle, he was asked to join the Institutional Review Board, the equivalent of the Institutional Review Board out there. So the ethics committee, he didn't want to join, but it was made clear to him that he had to. This protocol 126 was underway when he joined the IRB, and he was alarmed by it immediately. Initially by the lack of information that was given to the IRB, but as the trial proceeded, by how it was turning out because patients were dying in the study. This was a study that lasted 12 years in the end, and almost nobody survived it.
I think you say when it ended, 84 out of 85 subjects were dead.
Exactly. The issue, I think, for John, there were a number of issues. One was that with each unsuccessful try at this study, which usually meant death for the patient, the researchers would tweak the study in some new way to allow it to continue. Maybe if we did this, it would work better. But nothing worked. Yet every time it was given a green light by the IRB. Now, John was on the IRB. He was protesting, but he could get nobody else on the IRB to join him, largely because one of the investigators on the study was a legendary figure in bone marrow transplantation, Don Thomas. He would eventually win the Nobel Prize for medicine for his role in developing bone marrow transplantation.
That Nobel Prize, did it come after this study?
Yes, came in 1990. Now, John was also taking care of patients in the study that he became very close to, and he could see that they were dying. He was what, you would generally call an internal dissenter for his entire time at the Hutch, but the study kept going ahead.
And Carl, what were the patients told when they signed up? Were they told, this is what the response rate of the standard treatment is, this is what the experimental treatment is trying to do?
No, they were not told. They were not told anything at all about the results. And that's normal. It's an ongoing study.
But were they told what the standard treatment was? Because if I'm very ill and there's no effective treatment, I, as a patient, am prepared to take a much greater risk. If I've got a serious cancer and I know the standard treatment is up to 60%, well, that sounds quite satisfactory. So I'm going to be less prepared to take a risk on my treatment than I would if you said, look, Liz, standard treatment only has a 1% success rate.
Yes. If they had been told that explicitly, they probably wouldn't have signed up for the trial, but they weren't. One of the striking things about John's story is that he sort of began a covert operation trying to convince people not to join the study. If you worked on the wards, according to John, you were expected to recruit people into a whole range of different studies. There were constantly studies going on at the Hutch. He felt so alarmed by the fact that this study had been so completely unsuccessful and that people were dying that he began telling them this and saying, I cannot recommend that you join this study. This was something that he had to keep on the down low because he was supposed to be recruiting subjects into the study. And he said there were some patients who, even after he told them, I don't think that you should enroll in this study, they enrolled anyway. I remember him telling me that one patient just said, look, if it's good enough for the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, it's good for me.
I can scarcely think of another example where we've got up to 60% success rate in the standard treatment and a 0% success rate in the trial treatment at almost 100% mortality risk.
Exactly. It's horrific. They just weren't told the difference between that and the experimental treatment. I should say that the information about this all comes from, obviously, my conversations with John Pasando and his notes, but there was also an award-winning Seattle Times series on this in 2001. And as a result of that series, eventually, families bring litigation against the hutch.
Which was ultimately unsuccessful.
Unsuccessful, right.
And you actually start your book with a quote from John, which says, "Every whistleblower is an amateur playing against professionals."
Yeah, he said that the very first time I met him. I chose it because this is a thematic element for the book. Nobody understands what this is going to involve before they start. Nobody. Nobody understands the forces that they're up against, and nobody understands particularly what it's going to do to them. Even people who have some confidence in their own power, their own ability, their own authority, whatever, don't realize how dark the world is going to seem to them once they're in the middle of this fight. The other piece of that quote is the professionals, which is the organization, because they know everything about this. They've been through it many times. And so when you're a whistleblower, you're fighting against an organization that has an entire team of professionals, crisis managers, PR people, attorneys, administrators, all of whom have been through this, know exactly what to do, have generally been successful in doing it, and they're ready, and you're not.
I think it's difficult for whistleblowers to believe because one of the reasons I chose this particular example was a study which had almost 100% mortality. You think, surely there must have been other people who were prepared to speak up. So it is very difficult to understand, I think, in such an extreme case.
Yeah, I know. It would be interesting to talk to bystanders to abuses.
Yeah. During the process of the book, you, I'm sure, went to the hutch and asked them about the various allegations that John had raised. What was their response?
Well, I mean, for the hutch, this is something that was settled 25 years ago. They were vindicated.
They defended successfully against the litigation.
Yes, but they won in every way. After John was fired, after 5 years at the hutch, he never worked in medical research again. He has spent the rest of his life reviewing disability claims for the Social Security Administration.
That was actually going to be my next question, Carl, because I found that so depressing that this incredibly bright academic, who spent the first half of his life training to be a cancer researcher and the second half reviewing disability claims.
Yes.
Another case you report in the book is a study that happened in Cincinnati, and its purpose was to help the Pentagon determine how much radiation American soldiers could withstand during a nuclear attack. And can you explain what happened in this case?
Yes, the researcher from this study was a radiologist named Eugene Sanger, who had this Pentagon funding to study whole body radiation. The purpose, as you mentioned, was to develop a kind of dosimeter, basically to figure out what would happen to subjects if they were subjected to massive irradiation. Would they start to vomit? Would their vision be impaired? What if they were flying a plane? These kinds of things. But to test that, they were taking about 60% African American subjects who had cancers and subjecting them to whole body irradiation without telling them that this was a Pentagon funded study, without telling them that it was likely to kill them, without really telling them anything much at all.
And did they think that this radiation was going to help them?
No, that would have been an interesting side effect of the study, an interesting finding, but that's not what they were measuring.
What they weren't told was the dangerous side effects of total body irradiation.
Right, that this may kill them within weeks, which it sometimes did.
And in this case, there's a young academic, Martha Stevens, who's actually working in the English department, and she begins to investigate what's going on following reports in the press.
Exactly. When Martha found out about it was in 1971, so Vietnam War era. Campuses were a sort of hotbed for anti-war activism in the United States because of the military draft. And this was very shortly after the National Guard had killed a number of anti-war protesters at Kent State University, which is just up the road in Ohio. And so Martha was one of those anti-war activists. And when she found out that there was Pentagon-funded research going on at the University of Cincinnati, where she worked, she just decided she had to find out what it was about. And she relentlessly sort of launched this investigation asking for the research data in the medical school and got it. And despite having no background in medicine or radiology or really science of any kind, taught herself what was going on and put together a report herself and organized a group of also young, mostly untenured professors in the humanities at the University of Cincinnati. They call themselves the Junior Faculty Association, and had a press conference. And it was picked up by the Washington Post, caught the attention of Senator Edward Kennedy, and entered into the congressional record, which obviously set off a lot of alarms all over.
And basically what happened was, after the irradiation, a number of these patients obviously have symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, but they weren't given any medication for, I think, 3 days. And so the symptoms they would have been suffering from would have been things like nausea, fatigue, weakness.
Exactly. I mean, they were in real pain, just agony. But, the protocol called for no treatment for that.
And the way this syndrome plays out, there's then usually a latent period of about 20 days, which is then followed by another period of acute illness, fever, abdominal pain, diarrhea, bleeding, shock, which sometimes leads to death.
Exactly. And it did.
Her findings are pretty devastating. A quarter of the patients died within 38 days of irradiation.
Exactly.
And yet, the majority of these patients weren't on the verge of death before irradiation.
Exactly.
And really no informed consent.
None at all at the beginning of the study. As opposition to the study grew and criticism over the years, they were eventually told some things about it. But even at the very end, they were not told about the risk of death from this study.
This is clearly a tragedy for the patients involved. But I suppose from a whistleblower's perspective, it's a slightly less gloomy story than most, because Martha Stevens is one of the few whistleblowers whose career wasn't blighted by her actions.
That's right. I mean, she was protected to some extent because she was in the English department rather than in the medical school. Distance from the scene of the crime very often makes it easier. Easier in the sense that it's harder to retaliate directly, but easier also, I think, psychologically. A lot of whistleblowers feel a kind of sense of disloyalty blowing the whistle on their own organization.
Which she was still doing.
Which she was doing, but it was in the medical school rather than in her department, which gave her a measure of psychological distance from it.
But I suppose many organisations would see somebody in another department raising these issues. They're still whistleblowing against an organisation and potentially bringing that organisation into disrepute.
Exactly.
But somehow for her head of department, for example, did support her. But if they hadn't, it might have been different.
It might have been different. I mean, one of the things that was striking about talking to Martha and her husband, Jerome, who was also involved in the Junior Faculty Association and wrote some really interesting, extraordinarily perceptive articles about this. These two, and I think a lot of academics of that era, just seemed to feel as if speaking out and taking risks were part of the job.
But perhaps it was also easier because they were anti-war protesters. This was Pentagon research, and therefore there would have been a body of support for their perspective.
Absolutely. Civil rights as well was also very important to them, and this was a largely minority population. And so they did have a group of supporters and were part of a movement in a way that I think gave them a measure of psychological protection and this feeling of solidarity with other people. Again, the success of this for Martha was mixed in a way, and it went on for much longer. The part that I think she feels good about is that she stopped the study, did get the study shut down. Nobody else suffered and died. There was not much else The victims of the study were never notified that they were actually in a study. There was no lawsuit. There was no external investigation vindicating them. It was just sort of quietly shut down.
Clearly, other things should have happened, but at least compared to the last case we discussed, she didn't lose her job. Her career wasn't badly affected by this.
Right. She just put it behind her until it reemerged again. The reemergence came in the mid-90s with the revelations by a journalist named Eileen Wellsome that the Cincinnati radiation study was not a single study. There was a whole range of federally funded studies being conducted all over the United States in which people were unwittingly exposed to radiation and often died or were made sick and were not told about it. This was during the Clinton administration. There was a task force, a national commission devoted to this. Learning about this made Martha Stevens get involved yet again. And this time, what she did with the help of a graduate student was start trying to track down victims and victims' families and let them know what had happened to their family member and put them in touch with a lawyer or a lawsuit against the University of Cincinnati. There was a settlement, but it took forever. Most of the families were not happy with it. Sanger, the investigator in the study, absolutely refused to apologize. And even when the National Commission, the Radiation Commission, came out with its results, most, at least many of the victims, felt very unsatisfied with that.
Clearly, whistleblowers need much more support and protection than they currently have. What would you do to better protect whistleblowers?
There are formal laws against retaliating against whistleblowers, federal law, and then some states. Of course, these things are important. I think what many whistleblowers don't realize are the things that you can't legislate against.
Just recently in the UK, the British paper, the Daily Telegraph, reported that the British General Medical Council chairman acknowledged that the system for assessing doctors' fitness to practice is being weaponised against those who raise patient safety concerns.
Those are the things that shouldn't happen, and you can legislate against. Weaponizing those kinds of recommendations and investigations shouldn't be allowed. All of the sort of the formal retaliations, the demotions, the complaints, the firing, the discipline, all that sort of thing. Obviously, whistleblowers need to be protected against that. I think the difficulty is that there are a lot of things about blowing the whistle that can't be legislated against, and those are the psychological effects. To be a whistleblower requires at least small bit of optimism, of idealism, the expectation that if you blow the whistle, other people are going to be as outraged by the harms and the abuses as you are. And most people just assume that their friends will stand by them. They hope that at least some of their colleagues will stand by them. They think, or at least hope, have some expectation that what they have embarked on is going to have some success. And very often, none of these things happen. People aren't as outraged as they are. Sometimes they're not outraged at all. Their friends don't stand by them, or at least not all of them do. And very often, their colleagues stand with the institution against them. And the result is not what they've been hoping for. The result is often this sort of devastating loss. They struggle then to make some sense of it. They've been struggling all along, the sense of loneliness, the sense of betrayal. People haven't stood by them. Anger at all of these people, paranoia. Very often people get very paranoid about the forces that they see working against them. It sends them to a very dark place. And at the end, there is no happy resolution. And then they struggle because none of the things that they believed in and that they were counting on that sort of motivated them to do what they felt was the right thing had the effect that they were counting on. These are the kind of things that you can't make laws against, right? I mean, yes, it would help if you can't be fired. And yes, of course, it would help if you're not recommended for discipline by the medical council. All of these things would help, but they wouldn't fix the problem.
It wouldn't stop an organisation making it unpleasant for you to work in it or to thwart your career prospects if you stayed.
Or just the feeling that you're alone. The values that you've built your life on turn out to be wrong or false, and that they're not shared by the rest of the world. I mean, it's a kind of existential blow to have the ground collapse beneath your feet like that. And whistleblowers struggle to tell themselves some sort of story that gives some meaning to what they've done.
Do you think you've ever recovered from your whistleblowing?
Oh, I don't think recovery is the correct way to describe it. I've emerged from it. Writing the book has helped me make some sense of it. One of the things that I think has been helpful for me, and I think helps for a lot of people who survive this sort of thing, is understanding the patterns, understanding how these things usually go. What's happened to me is essentially what usually happens. I mean, that helps. The other thing that I think is more important than anything, and this is another pattern that I found in the book, is you've got to have solidarity. The people who fared the worst are the people who try to do it by themselves. So, for example, Martha Stevens that we talked about, she had the Junior Faculty Association behind her. She also had the sense that she was part of a larger movement, the sense that you were part of a civil rights struggle, that you were part of an anti-war struggle, and that those were righteous causes. That's a very meaningful thing.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for talking today, for revealing and, I have to say, somewhat depressing reality of being a whistleblower. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the show, if you could leave a review, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.